Today, we're diving into one of the biggest what-ifs of World War II. It's all about the aid the Western Allies sent to the Soviet Union, a program called Lend-Lease. Was it just a nice little bonus for the Soviets, or was it the one thing that kept them from collapsing completely? Let's get into it.
Let's put it bluntly. Could the Red Army have ever made it to Berlin if it wasn't running on American fuel and riding on American wheels? It's a hugely controversial question, and the answer really gets to the heart of who deserves the credit for defeating Nazi Germany.
All right, so to really get why this aid was even on the table, we've got to rewind to the summer of '41. And let me tell you, for the Soviet Union, the situation was beyond dire. It was catastrophic. So, the Germans launch Operation Barbarossa, and they just storm across the border, swallowing up the USSR's industrial heartland, the very place where they made everything. So what do the Soviets do? In this absolutely insane feat of desperation, they start taking their factories apart, piece by piece, and putting them on trains heading east. By October, a mind-blowing 80% of their entire industrial base is literally on wheels. And by December, the Germans are at the gates of Moscow. This is a fight for survival, plain and simple. And look, this wasn't just about soldiers on the front line. The entire system was crumbling. One historian argues the Soviet economy was on the verge of total failure, kind of like Germany in World War I. And it's pretty simple, right? If your economy fails, you can't build tanks, you can't make bullets, you can't fight. It's in this absolute moment of desperation that those first Allied aid convoys start their dangerous journey. Okay, so let's dig into the first side of this whole debate. This is the argument that, yeah, the Allied aid was nice to have, but the real victory, that was forged in Soviet factories, with Soviet steel and paid for with Soviet blood.
And this right here is the absolute core of their argument. Think about it. The Red Army stopped the German war machine, a force that seemed completely unstoppable, right outside Moscow. And they did it before any major Lend-Lease shipments had even shown up. Who did it? They did, with their own guns, their own tanks, and just an incredible, unimaginable amount of sacrifice.
And let's talk about those weapons for a second, because wow, the Soviets were turning out these brilliant, tough-as-nails designs like the T-34 tank, which, by the way, was a complete and utter shock to the Germans. Their gear was simple, it worked, and it was tailor-made for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. And you know that rigid, centrally planned economy? Kind of clunky in peacetime, sure. But for a total, all-out war, it was a machine built to throw every single thing it had into the fight. But that's just one side of the coin, right? Now we get to the other argument. And this one says, okay, the Soviets had the muscle, no doubt. But the Allies? They provided the nervous system, the food, the fuel, the technology, all the stuff that makes the muscle actually work. And this is a perfect example of how it all worked. The Soviets are geniuses at making simple, super tough hardware, like the T-34. But their high-tech stuff? Not so much. Their radios, for example, were famously awful. One Soviet tanker called them complex and unreliable. Meanwhile, who's great at making electronics? The US. So you get this perfect match, a tough-as-nails Soviet tank with a reliable American radio inside. All of a sudden, that tank is a game changer. Okay, now we're going to get into the numbers, and honestly, they are just staggering. Let's start with this one. 409,000. What is that? That's the number of trucks the Western Allies sent to the Soviet Union. Just let that sink in for a second. By the end of the war, if you saw 3 trucks in the Red Army, 2 of them were foreign-made. 2 out of 3. Without those trucks, all those huge Soviet offensives from '43 on would have run out of gas, literally, after just a few miles. These trucks gave the Red Army legs, the mobility it desperately needed to win. All right, you ready for the next number? 53%. According to one Russian historian, that's how much of all the explosives used by the Soviet Union came from the West.
Yeah, that's astonishing. Remember how they had to move all their factories? A lot of those were ammunition plants. So Lend-Lease wasn't just a little top-up. It provided more than half of the gunpowder and TNT, the stuff that goes boom. So picture this, more than 1 out of every 2 artillery shells the Red Army fired was filled with stuff that came from the Allies. That's insane.
And one last big number for you, 51.5%. That's the Allied share of high-octane aviation fuel. See, the Soviets can make tons of low-grade fuel, no problem. But the good stuff, the high-performance fuel you need for modern fighter planes, they just couldn't produce enough of it. So Allied fuel came over, they mixed it in with their own stuff, and suddenly their Air Force could go toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe.
And this right here shows that it wasn't always about the sheer quantity. Sometimes it was all about timing. Sure, the total number of Allied tanks sent over was way smaller than what the Soviets built themselves, but when they arrived, that was everything. At the height of the Battle of Moscow, the absolute darkest hour, these British tanks made up something like 30 to 40% of the new heavy tank reinforcements. They showed up right when the house was on fire.
So, there you have it. Two really powerful arguments. On one side, Soviet grit and industry won the war. On the other, these unbelievable numbers that suggest victory was impossible without Allied help. So, what do the experts and the people who are actually there have to say?
Well, this one might be the biggest bombshell of all. Publicly, Stalin always downplayed the Allied aid, but behind closed doors, it was a totally different story. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, later wrote that Stalin admitted to his inner circle that without that Western aid, they would not have been able to cope. Basically, they would have lost.
Even today, historians are still duking it out. You've got experts like David Glantz, who thinks the Soviets probably still would have won, but it would have taken another year, maybe two, and cost millions more lives. But then you have a historian like Boris Sokolov, who is completely firm on this. He says, nope, without the aid, the USSR could not have resisted the German aggression, period. But, maybe the final word should go to the guy who actually led the Red Army all the way to Berlin, Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Years after the war, in private, he just cut through all the political nonsense. He said, plainly, that without American materials, they simply could not have equipped their armies or continued the war. So while the debate over whether Lend-Lease was the deciding factor will go on, its undeniable importance was confirmed by the very man who led the charge to Berlin.